An airship, a dirigible, is a type of aerostat, a lighter-than-air aircraft that can navigate through the air under its own power. Aerostats gain the lift from a large gas bags filled with a lifting gas that is less dense than the surrounding air. In early dirigibles, the lifting gas used was hydrogen, due to its high lifting capacity and ready availability. Helium gas has almost the same lifting capacity and is not flammable, unlike hydrogen, but is rare and relatively expensive. Significant amounts were first discovered in the United States, and for a while helium was only used for airships by the United States. Most airships built since the 1960s have used helium, though some have used hot air. The envelope of an airship may form a single gas bag, or may contain a number of internal gas-filled cells. An airship also has engines, crew, and optionally also payload accommodation, typically housed in one or more gondolas, suspended below the envelope. The main types of airship are non-rigid, semi-rigid, and rigid. Non-rigid airships, often called blimps, rely on internal pressure to maintain the shape of the airship. Semi-rigid airships maintain the envelope shape by internal pressure, but have some form of supporting structure, such as a fixed keel, attached to it. Rigid airships have an outer structural framework which maintains the shape and carries all structural loads, while the lifting gas is contained in one or more internal gas bags or cells. Rigid airships were first flown by Count Zeppelin, and the vast majority of rigid airships built were manufactured by the firm he founded. As a result, rigid airships are called Zeppelins. Airships were the first aircraft capable of controlled powered flight, and were most commonly used before the 1940s. But the use decreased over time as the capabilities were surpassed by those of aeroplanes. The decline was accelerated by a series of high-profile accidents, including the 1930 crash and burning of British R-101 in France, the 1933 and 1935 storm-related crashes of the twin airborne aircraft carrier U.S. Navy helium-filled rigids, the Usakran and Usmakan respectively, and the 1937 burning of the hydrogen-filled Hindenburg. For the 1960s, helium airships have been used in applications where the ability to hover in one place for an extended period outweighs the need for speed and maneuverability, such as advertising, tourism, camera platforms, geological surveys, and aerial observation. Terminology: airship. During the pioneer years of aeronautics, terms such as airship, and ship of the air meant any kind of navigable or dirigible flying machine. In 1919, Frederick Handley Page was reported as referring to ships of the air, with smaller passenger types as air yachts. Quote, "In the 1930s, large intercontinental flying boats were also sometimes referred to as ships of the air or flying ships. Nowadays the term airship is used only for powered, dirigible balloons, with subtypes being classified as rigid, semi-rigid and non-rigid. Aerostat. An aerostat is an aircraft which remain aloft using buoyancy or static lift, as opposed to the aerodyne which obtains lift by moving through the air. Airships are a type of aerostat. The term aerostat has also been used to indicate a tethered or moored balloon as opposed to a free-floating balloon. Dirigible airships were originally called dirigible balloons from the Latin dirigere, meaning to direct or steer. Blimp. A blimp is a non-rigid aerostat. In American usage it refers specifically to a non-rigid type of dirigible balloon or airship. In British usage it refers to any non-rigid aerostat, including barrage balloons and other kite balloons, having a streamlined shape and stabilizing tail fins. Zeppelin. The term Zeppelin is a genericized trademark which originally referred to airships manufactured by the German Zeppelin Company, built and operated the first rigid airships in the early years of the 20th century. The initials LZ for Luftschiff Zeppelin usually prefixed their craft serial identifiers. In technical usage, rigid airship is the term used for all aircraft of this type, with Zeppelin referring only to aircraft of that manufacture. In modern common usage, the terms Zeppelin and airship are used interchangeably for any type of rigid airship. Classification. Airships are classified, according to the method of construction, into rigid, semi-rigid and non-rigid types. Rigid airships. A rigid airship has a rigid framework covered by an outer skin or envelope. The interior contains one or more gas bags, cells, balloons to provide lift. Rigid airships are typically unpressurized and can be made to virtually any size. Most, but not all, of the German Zeppelin airships have been of this type. Semi-rigid airships. A semi-rigid airship has some kind of supporting structure, but the main envelope is held in shape by the internal pressure of the lifting gas. Typically the airship has an extended, usually articulated keel running along the bottom of the envelope to stop it kinking in the middle by distributing suspension loads into the envelope, while also allowing lower envelope pressures. Non-rigid airships. Non-rigid airships are often called blimps. Most, but not all, of the American Goodyear airships have been blimps. A non-rigid airship relies entirely on internal gas pressure to retain its shape during flight. Unlike the rigid design, the non-rigid airship's gas envelope has no compartments. However, it typically has smaller internal bags or ballonets containing air. At sea level, the ballonets are filled with air. As altitude is increased, the lifting gas expands and air from the ballonets is expelled through valves to maintain the hull shape. To return to sea level, the process is reversed. Air is forced back into the ballonets by both scooping air from the engine exhaust and using auxiliary blowers. Construction. The two main parts of an airship are its gas-containing envelope and a gondola, a similar structure slung beneath and containing crew and other equipment. The engines may be mounted in the gondola or elsewhere off the envelope. Structure. The basic structure of an airship may be rigid, semi-rigid and non-rigid, as described. Envelope. The envelope itself is the outer surface, usually surrounding one or more gas bags of ballonets within it. Fins at the rear of the envelope stabilize the airship, allowing it to fly straight. On some smaller designs, these fins are themselves part of a gas bag and gain their shape only when inflated. A few airships have been metal-clad, with rigid and non-rigid examples made. Each kind used a thin gas-tight metal envelope, rather than the usual rubber-coated fabric envelope. Only 4 metal-clad ships are known to have been built, and only 2 actually flew. Schwarz's first aluminum rigid airship of 1893 collapsed, while his second flew. The non-rigid ZMC-2 built for the U.S. Navy flew from 1929 to 1941, when it was scrapped as too small for operational use on anti-submarine patrols, while the 1929 non-rigid Slate Aircraft Corporation City of Glendale collapsed on its first flight attempt. Both non-rigid ships nevertheless had strong metal monocoque envelopes which, while they maintained their shape uninflated, required an overpressure during flight. Lifting gas. Early airships used hydrogen as the lifting gas, which is the lightest available. Typically it was generated during the filling process, by reacting dilute sulfuric acid with metal filings. The first hydrogen balloon in 1783 used iron filings, while the British Nulli Secundus of 1907 used zinc. Later, the USA began to use helium because it is non-flammable and has 92.7% of the buoyancy of hydrogen. Following a series of airship disasters in the 1930s, and especially the Hindenburg disaster where the airship burst into flames, hydrogen fell into disuse. Thermal airships use a heated lifting gas, usually in a fashion similar to hot air balloons. The first to do so was flown in 1973 by the British company Cameron Balloons. Gondola. The term gondola is used to describe a crew car of an airship, slung beneath the center of the envelope. These may be short, for cockpit and landing gear alone, or longer to provide passenger space. Early gondolas were open structures slung beneath the envelope. Later ones were enclosed and hung directly from the internal framing. A non-rigid blimp carries all of its passengers within a gondola. Rigid airships may have further passenger or cargo space inside the envelope. The large airship Graf Zeppelin was noted for its distinctively short passenger gondola, mounted far forward so as to improve ground clearance. The majority of crew accommodation and cargo holds were placed inside the envelope. Propulsion and control. Small airships carried their engine in the gondola. Where there were multiple engines on larger airships, these were placed in separate nacelles, termed power cars or engine cars, to allow asymmetric thrust to be applied for maneuvering. These power cars were mounted towards the sides of the envelope, away from the center-lined gondola. This also raised them above the ground, reducing the risk of a propeller strike when landing. Widely spaced power cars were also termed wing cars, from the use of wing to mean being on the side of something, as in a theater, rather than the aerodynamic device. These engine cars carried a crew during flight who maintained the engines as needed, but who also worked the engine controls, throttle, etc., mounted directly on the engine. Instructions were relayed to them from the pilot's station by a telegraph system, as on a ship, while elevators and swiveling propellers provide fine control of altitude. Larger changes of height used to be controlled by either venting gas to lose altitude or dropping ballast to gain altitude. Large airships typically carried several water tanks fore and aft, allowing them to adjust longitudinal trim as well as height. Some modern designs instead pump lifting gas between the gas bags and storage cylinders.